Hey, I'm Zach McDonald, your real estate agent with Real Property Associates, and today I want to talk about the new Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement in Washington State. If you follow real estate news in any meaningful way, you've probably heard about some of the lawsuits involving the National Association of Realtors and other large real estate firms and brokerages having to do with compensation and other things in the real estate space. Now, Washington State has been ahead of the curve in a lot of ways, changing rules over the past few years preemptively and, well, before it was required. And we find ourselves in a place of transition, and recently there were some new laws and changes to the Washington State real estate brokerage laws, and I want to share those with you here today. We're not going to cover all of the changes, but I want to cover the one that I think has the most impact on buyers and sellers, specifically people looking to buy or sell a home in Washington State and in the Seattle area. And this new law or requirement was changed here. So we've got the brand new pamphlet for real estate brokerage in Washington, and we'll go over a couple things here in the pamphlet. But the biggest thing is this Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement. And that is now required for all people who want to buy a house with a real estate agent here in Washington State. This is what the pamphlet has to say about this new law. And I'll just read it because I think that's the best way to do it here. A real estate firm and brokers who perform real estate brokerage services for a buyer establish an agency relationship by performing those services. The firm's designated broker and any managing broker responsible for the supervision of that broker are also agents of the buyer. A written services agreement between the buyer and the firm must be entered into before or as soon as reasonably practical after a broker begins rendering real estate brokerage services to the buyer. And let's pause there because this is something that we're going to continue to get more information about and learn, and there's going to be hopefully more guidance on what does it even mean? What does reasonably practical even mean? It's, I think, intentionally vague as we figure this all out. But I think overall that these changes are good. I think it's good for the real estate industry in Washington State, and other states have had this agreement for a while. But in Washington State, we haven't had a requirement to sign a Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement or Buyer Broker Agreement. And I have not historically required clients to sign it either. And I would say that's been a general practice for real estate agents in Washington State. Now, other states have had a requirement to sign this agreement for a long time. So I mentioned Washington being ahead of the curve in some ways. I think this maybe is one way we've been behind the curve and we're trying to catch up. Now, I would say it's been more like the Wild West in Washington State for a while with real estate agents. Some buyers unintentionally have worked with tons of different agents all at the same time and haven't had a great process or experience in the buying process. They just kind of went online, found houses they wanted to see, toured them with different agents, and kind of stumbled into whoever the real estate agent was that helped them with the process. I think in other cases, buyers have reached out to an agent, or maybe they were connected with one. They sat down and had a formal buyer consultation. Maybe they saw a couple houses first, but then they had some type of a commitment or loyalty to their real estate agent to help them walk through the process of buying a house and also be the point of contact for them in that process. And I think ultimately that is a better outcome and experience for a buyer in general versus talking to lots of different people and not having any type of, I would say, commitment to an agent. Now, the agreement, if in some cases, allows for non-exclusivity. So there's not a requirement for exclusivity, although real estate agents may want to work exclusively with buyers, which is what I've tended to do historically. But other agents out there are open to working with buyers in a non-exclusive way. And again, I think that this agreement is just bringing clarity to the agency relationship, which in the past maybe was fuzzy. Now, a big thing that is also part of this is compensation. So there's been a lot of news about the compensation of real estate and how that works and who compensates and what the laws are there. And Washington has, for a while now, not required buyer-broker compensation from the seller in a listing agreement, although I've noticed over the past few years that not much has changed with the compensation structures, even with those law changes, and things might continue to evolve, and I would expect that they would. But the buyer brokerage services agreement, part of that is the compensation and how that's handled and how that's discussed, being discussed up front rather than maybe at the end of the process or somewhere in the middle. And that is, again, one of the requirements for the services agreement that buyers and buyer brokers will enter into. And I think I've just had some thoughts about this recently that I wanted to share. And the first one is that there are some potential pitfalls here for buyers. And the one that jumps out to me is accidentally entering into a buyer brokerage services agreement. Now, thankfully, the agreement does allow for a buyer to terminate the agreement or a broker to terminate the agreement. So there are allowances for that. But at the same time, I think that the biggest mistake that people make when they're buying a house, specifically their first one, is that they don't do enough research before starting to work with a particular agent. And I made a video about this maybe 8 months ago, 9 months ago. It was a while ago, but it was sometime earlier in 2023. And I talked about this mistake and maybe some of the ways to avoid making that mistake. Asking for referrals, going online, doing some research, reading reviews. Unfortunately, there are a lot of real estate agents out there, and that's a good thing, but it's also confusing. How do you know if your real estate agent has experience? How do you know if your real estate agent is professional? How do you know if your real estate agent is any good? And I think there are ways, like we just talked about, where you can do some research. So if you haven't seen that video, I would advise you go take a look at it. But I would also say that this is my concern, is that somebody might end up working with somebody that they didn't really want to, or they signed the agreement so they could go see some homes. That would be a second concern. Over the past 10 to 15 years, the internet has changed the buying process, at least for some, where people would have originally maybe talked to an agent or gone to some open houses that they stumbled into via a sign, but now they can go online, and there are plenty of real estate websites where you can see the available listings, maybe even contact agents to schedule tours. But as I read the law, and again, hopefully we'll have some more clarity on this, you may or may not need to have this agreement signed before you see a house. And if you're on one of these websites and you click, hey, I want to see this house, you may not have an opportunity to meet the real estate agent or talk to them about their experience, or talk to them about the services they offer, or talk to them about the buying process. And in that case, signing an agreement is a scary thing to me. I personally would want to sit down with the agent and talk through things before making a commitment like that on one of the biggest financial decisions in my life. Just me personally. Now, that's where the caution comes. I would be cautious or wary of signing something before you've had a chance to do some due diligence with the real estate agent that you're going to be working with. And what I would advise is that you schedule a buyer consultation. If you want to start looking at houses and you want to buy a house, for me, the process doesn't start with touring houses online. It starts with meeting with a real estate agent, or 2 or 3, whatever your decision-making process looks like, and talking through, number one, needs and wants, talking through the home buying process. If you're a more experienced buyer, maybe you skip the home buying process piece, but also asking questions of the real estate agent and making sure that you're a good fit to work with them and that they're a good fit to work with you. And after that meeting, that's when I, as a buyer, would have more confidence and be ready to commit to working with a real estate agent. And ultimately, I think that's a better process anyway than looking at houses online first. So again, my advice would be make sure that you don't sign an agreement with somebody that you haven't met. And the other piece of that would be make sure that you meet in person first before signing the agreement. So really it's the same advice. I think that this agreement is a great thing for the real estate community in Washington State. If you have questions about the Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement, I'm happy to forward along the pamphlet from Washington State that we were given that has more information about the duties of a buyer's broker and what is changing in the real estate law. I'm not a real estate attorney, so if you have specific questions about the law itself, that would be a conversation for a real estate attorney, and I'm happy to connect you with one of those as well. And if you want to discuss working with me as your buyer's broker, or at least interviewing me for that opportunity, I'd be glad to have that conversation with you too.